Funding for Poets and Their Craft on Vermont PBS is provided by Phoenix Books, with stores in Burlington, Rutland, and Essex, Vermont. Phoenix Books, supporting our communities in everything we do, from books to authors. Details and information at phoenixbooks.biz. Vermont College of Fine Arts, located in Montpelier, fosters the excellence of established and emerging writers, designers, artists, composers, teachers, and filmmakers through its graduate-level programs. Learn more at vcfa.edu. Northshire Bookstores, fostering discovery and serendipity for babies to the ageless, committed to building community one book at a time, with locations in Manchester, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York, and Middlebury Breadloaf School of English and Breadloaf Writers Conferences attract emerging and established faculty, students, and writers from around the country, a summer tradition for more than 90 years.
Hello, I'm Major Jackson. We are extremely fortunate today to have two immensely talented poets on the same stage together. In fact, they are the creative impetus behind the Poets and Their Craft series, a project that reveals both their commitment and support of poetry as a vital means of documenting life in Vermont. Mary Jane Dickerson, author of Tapping the Center of Things, has inspired a generation of young writers during her long career as professor of literature and poetry at UVM. Tamra J. Higgins is the president of the Poetry Society of Vermont. She is the author of Nothing Saved Us, Poems of the Korean War. They are co-founders of the Sundog Poetry Center. Their presentation as a team at Phoenix Books in Burlington is a unique analysis of the convergence of history and poetry called Conjuring Voices of the Past. But first, here are some thoughts from Michael DeSanto, owner of the bookstore.
Poetry matters because history matters, and where we've come from as a human being matters. So poets today, if they were thrown back 3 or 4 or 5,000 years and had to read a poem in front of an audience, the audience would know what they were doing. They would know that it's a poem. And vice versa. If some Greek fella popped in here and started to do a poetry reading in my store today, people would automatically know. You'd feel it, that it was poetic. So poetry matters because it connects us all as human beings.
Mary Jane and I will be looking at how to integrate history into poetry. And I want to start off by mentioning Audre Lorde's essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury. It's a text that I return to if I start to doubt the reason for writing poetry. If I ask myself that dangerous question, why? As in, why should I write about my feelings or explore unanswered questions? Why write about past lives or historical events in poetry? To me, Lorde answers these questions in that essay, particularly in this section. Quote, "The white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am. But the black mother's in each of us, the poet, whistler in our dreams. I feel, therefore I can be free." Poetry coins the language to express and charter this revolutionary awareness and demand the implementation of that freedom, end quote. To me, writing about the past frees the past and the lives in it. The historical poem could be the story of a famous event told from a perspective of someone who hasn't been heard from yet. Or the poem may uncover past events that have been kept hidden by the writers of history, that is, those in power at the time. Poems that relate more to personal past are also written, as all poetry is, to reveal discoveries and gather new insights. Writing about the past requires both research and imagination. When I first read the poem, The Book of the Dead, by Muriel Rukeyser, I thought, that's the kind of poem I want to write. Through her poem, Rukeyser chartered a revolutionary awareness and demand that Lorde refers to. The Book of the Dead chronicles the course of events that took place in West Virginia during the building of a mountain tunnel and the treatment of workers by Union Carbide in the 1930s when silica was discovered in the rock in the tunnel they were blasting for the tunnel. I included a synopsis of the poem in the handouts. I didn't include the whole poem because it's 78 pages long, so I saved you that. To conjure voices of the past, such as Ruckeiser did for the Union Carbide victims, there are some things to consider. And this is just a little nuts and bolts list that I thought of when I was thinking about conjuring voices and writing and integrating history into poetry. You need to think about the size and the scope of the project. Will you explore an entire history of an event, or one segment, or an instance of that segment of that piece of history? You need to consider the point of view. From whose eyes will the poem be told? Who is the narrator? You need to think about managing the material and what the style will be. What questions are you trying to answer by writing the poem? What's different about your exploration of the subject from what already exists about it? Publishers want to know that one a lot. How much historical material will you use? How do you set aside your own biases, stereotypes, and beliefs to consider new possibilities in both content and the interpretation of the content? And how do you make the historical poetic? Of course, these questions are answered as research reveals information, as thoughts and ideas formulate, and as the poem begins to appear from the synthesis of evidence and imagination. When writing my poems in my book, Nothing Saved Us, Poems of the Korean War, I used many different resources. I think the complete bibliography is about 5 pages, single-spaced. But the most important resource was my father. I interviewed him over the course of 2 years, allowing him to tell his stories. Sometimes he needed a bit of coaxing, but other times he would just blurt out a memory. He would just say, there was this time I volunteered, and the story would go on. I wrote down everything he said, and from those conversations, I shaped the poems. Because the poems are told in first-person narrative, some people have mistakenly thought that they're just transcriptions of his stories, but they're not. They are my poetic interpretations of his stories. While the events are true in the first section of the book, they are rewritten as poetry. There was this time I volunteered. It happened when our Corsairs dropped napalm bombs, melted the air, and jellied the ground like toast. Anyone close enough, it smelt. I was a hill away, and underneath my gear, my shirt was drenched in seconds from that wall of heat a mile thick. The planes veered back, swooping away like swallows in the evening after bugs. Then the snipers hit. How did those bastards do it? They should have been dissolved into the ground. Curious as my commander, I got myself all muddy, hair, face, hands, was halfway there already, packed grenades and shotguns for close range, and sneaked into the North Koreans' trenches. We blended in. My buddy, 'cause he looked like them, and me, I kept my helmet down. We elbowed our way through 1,000 men, only to find we was the same as them. And that night there is why my heart's still disconnected from my mind. But we found their secret, tunnels underneath the lines made from all those Chinese lackeys. 2 million had joined by then, hauling out 2 million buckets full of earth. Inside the tunnels, they'd block the exits so the napalm bombs wouldn't liquefy their skin. And when the planes retreated, they'd open up the tunnel, pop up, and shoot at us across the line. Once we saw how those damn moles were sniping through our nape attacks, we worked our way back south, reported in, and never volunteered again. The events in this poem are true. However, my father never told me, and that night there is why my heart's still disconnected from my mind. He doesn't speak like that. You can tell the way he speaks from some of the other parts of the poem. But of course, that incident certainly contributed to the soldiers' need to sever emotion from intellect, to create the separation between the ability to murder, as a soldier needs to do, and the ability to carry on day-to-day life, raising a family. I created those lines hoping to show a pivotal point in the narrator's psyche and the long-term effects of war. I grew up with my father, and he would share some stories of his experience in Korea, but they were kind of always the same snippets. And when I went back and formally interviewed him over the course of about 18 months, this was a story that he told me that I had never heard before. And it was the first, learning that he actually volunteered and went crossed the 38th parallel, went into the North Korean trenches to try to figure out how the North Koreans were surviving through the napalm attacks. Was a pretty shocking thing to find out. And when I shared that with different people, I had all sorts of reactions from what an idiot to I can't believe he would volunteer and do that. And so that was kind of a story I had to really work at to put in in a poetry form. In another poem, Purple Heart Recipient, I use Wilfred Owen's poem, The Last Laugh, as a model. Wilfred Owen was a British soldier and poet who fought in World War I. Interestingly, the Korean War was very similar to World War I, particularly in the in their use of trench warfare. So I thought it was important to include something of that war, just as a continuation of, war to the next war, to the next war, to the next war that we are always involved in. The specific form of Owen's poem lends itself to really tightening up the lines and emphasizing the image, which helped me, I think, and hope to create a better poem. Also, by ending this section of the book with repetition of what comes before Wilfred Owen's war poem, it is an acknowledgement of the continuation of war that we are always involved in, and that war, or rather the individuals, be they soldier or civilian, will always be important to write about. Owen was one of the first poets who wrote graphically rather than patriotically about the war, and he was killed in action at age 25. Purple Heart Recipient. After Wilfred Owen's The Last Laugh. My God, the doctor groaned. The stump's a mess. Surgery, recovery, 3 months at best. Needles probed, nerves snarled, knives cleaved them from scars, and the AWOL foot itched. What, lost your job again, she said and cried. And the baby kicked and the 5 kids whined. And the South Dakota snow and wind set their fangs in tight, and eviction hissed at the door. The VA rep said 60%, get a second job if it don't pay rent. And the graveyard shift grabbed hold of me, and double shifts pulled me apart, and hope slept. How much research is needed when conjuring the voices of the past? Although only a small percentage of what you discover will end up in your poetry, it requires and deserves extensive investigation. What you research becomes what you know. Therefore, how much you uncover and learn has an overall significant impact. This may be revealed through a seemingly small detail. For example, in my research, I learned that, for the second part of the book, I learned that in the Korean culture, wedding dresses are traditionally green, not white like in the American culture. And this found its way into the second part of the book, which follows a Korean woman through the war. Because I'm not Korean, because I did not go through the war, the second section of the book is based on extensive research, much of which was the memoirs of Korean women that I read. What does connect me to this topic, however, is that I am a woman, and although I will never be able to know what these women went through due to our separation in time, culture, and circumstances, I am able to conjure their voices through research, yes, but just as importantly, through imagination, and my imagination as a woman and a mother. Through these means, I try to accomplish the implementation of that freedom that Audre Lorde reminds us we must do. And just to end, I will read the last section of this, the second section of the book that follows this Korean woman. I cannot help but think of first son. Did he reach 15? Is he seen bicycling on a dusty village road or in the square of Pyongyang? Is a living boy bitter and alone better than a dead infant son? Where's father? Where are you, grandmother? 50 years without a word. You do not know daughters. Sons have grown while armistice hangs on. Landmines hide behind a line. Barbed wire still punctures the view of you. My hibiscus blooms late in the summer. Each bloom lasts only a day. But each day brings a vision of home. Boricha in my teacup, cradled in both hands. The green of my first wedding dress. 5,000 years of memories. First of all, a poem should make a person feel something. And a lot of times poetry is sometimes ruined by teachers or whomever asking what the poem's about. And really what we need to do first of all is get an emotional reaction out of the poem. Then we can go back and dissect it if we want for different layers of meaning. But if it doesn't move us emotionally, I don't think it's doing its job as a poem. At some point, you do have to put aside the research in order to create something new. It is in the interpretation of the information, not in its summary, that makes the difference between historical report and poetry. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Mary Jane, who is going to share a little bit more about the struggles we have to face when we are about what we are witness to and the complexities of our experiences.
When I first began to make poetry from my own North Carolina past, some 40 years ago now, I knew even then that I was writing out of a homesickness. But it was not a homesickness for my parents, my sister, my village of Cameron, North Carolina. It has taken me years and many poems later to come into a fuller understanding of the deeper yearning that stimulated so many of these poems. Indeed, I could not fully articulate what was going on until very recently when I was before an audience to read many of these poems. Looking out at the faces of those who had come to hear, I heard myself saying that the central and most significant fact of my existence, beyond the family I had been born into and the one I helped to create, was growing up in a racially segregated society into a world shaped by the circumstances of that segregation. Until that moment, I had not fully come into that difficult knowledge that both my personal history and that of my region and nation meant I was compelled to address. Out of that homesickness, I wrote the following poem that I used to conclude the reading. February snows keep coming, falling in a heavy silence from the ashen sky, hour after hour, turning day into night, night into day. Vermont's northerly peaks and valleys flatten into an expanse without dimension, a whiteness that washes all other color away, shaping in me that lingering sense, after all these years, of always being out of place, always a stranger in an even stranger land. February snows bring me home to what I have missed even more than a familiar and gentle southern landscape, even more than the intimate culture of family and place. February snows bring me home to what I have missed most from the pulse and rhythm of everyday life, to what turned life itself into possibilities of improvisation. That daily presence of African Americans, Black people whose names with cadence and timbre of voices still reverberates in memory, whose faces still appear everywhere across my homescape and theirs, deep in rural North Carolina. But from my window, only bare-branched trees, stirred by winter's wind into black hieroglyphics on white parchment, break up a whiteness given shape and meaning by those shadowed contours and lines scripted in black. February's white loneliness hollows out warmth from the body leaning into the howl of blizzard knocking at the door. Yet each February, frozen into place, stirs longing for a landscape soon to be worn by human figures moving in black and white, whose lives matter, each to the other, whose kinship goes beyond blood, whose intertwined histories of boundaries and bondages shape who we are, who we must become, each in relationship to the other, drawn in white and black. None of us is ever separated from the historical. We are part of the historical. Now I think people are much more aware of living in a history. And maybe it's technology, maybe it's television, maybe it's all those things that make us much more aware of being a part of a larger world, even as we are a part of our family histories, our town history, our regional histories. But I think it has something to do with the world is too much with us, late and soon. Most recently, I have finally tried to come to terms with a specific fact in our ongoing civil rights struggle, one that I have talked about in the classroom and one I have read about in other poems, especially those by African American poets. In August of 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till, black, was brutally lynched in Money, Mississippi. For years, that date has held significance for me, not only for its searing meaning as a major catalyst for the civil rights movement, but also for my awareness of what I, white, was doing in the American South at 17 years of age. The contrast could not have been more stark. In preparation for drafting the poem that became Long Hot Summers, I researched the archives of North Carolina's premier newspaper, the News and Observer, to see what news coverage I could find about Emmett Till's 1955 lynching. I wondered about my total ignorance in a family keenly interested in the news. Was it discussed without my paying attention? But I could find no news accounts about Emmett Till's death or open casket funeral in Chicago. To me, that omission has come to be even worse than my teenage ignorance. Certain similarities in this slice of American history made me examine my own circumstances in a rural, segregated southern town against the backdrop of what was going on elsewhere. I regard the poem, Long Hot Summers, as only one of many to come that must examine a painful history all of us are continuing to share and to ponder because our very lives as citizens of a democracy demand that we do so. In August of 1955, at 17, no more on my mind than going away to college in September, I worked noontimes in my father's store after long mornings under the tobacco shed, where mounting heat beat down to ripple in waves along the tin roof. At the store's lunch counter, I assembled hot dogs by the dozens at 2 for a quarter, stacked moon pies, and pulled cold RCs from the cooler. calling each customer by name. Charlie Littlejohn, Andrew Kelly, his sisters Pinky and Janie, Thelma Williams, and Earl Crutchfield. I took worn dollar bills from hands, black hands and white, my hands and theirs, calloused with sticky traces of black tar. From a morning working together, handling tobacco to slowly cure in tall tobacco barns. When I placed change, silver and copper, onto their outstretched palms, those coins felt cool against the lingering heat from our skin. Was it during one of those moments while I, a white store owner's daughter, was making change for white and black farm laborers, exchanging the day-to-day words of our small town world? Was it then that in Money, Mississippi, 14-year-old Emmett Till might have whistled at, said something to the white store owner's wife, sounds still in dispute, words perhaps never uttered at all, what we'll never know from lips forever sealed, only hours later in the brutal violation of that other teenager's still growing body? Was that the summer the KKK left a stack of printed brochures on my father's store counter? Paper he set afire on the cement pavement, separating the store from the gas pumps. How much did I think about it in 1956 when I returned to school after another long, hot summer of working in tobacco and clerking at the store, to find my North Carolina Women's College had integrated itself by placing its first 2 young black women in isolation, just the 2 of them living together on a single dormitory floor, separated from all the others in their freshman class. I think people go to poetry, write poetry, read poetry, recite poetry, because nothing else can take its place.